In this video, I'm going to show you how to download and install Android Studio, which is a program we're going to be using to write our Android applications in this course. Just a reminder that this is the Windows video, so if you're running a Mac or a Linux machine, refer to a separate video in this section where you can follow along for the installation instructions for those operating systems. So moving forward, presuming you're on Windows, at this point I'm going to assume you're running a 64-bit version of Windows. Now, so swing over to this link here on screen, and there's a link to this in the resources section of this video. The 32-bit Android Studio has been deprecated, meaning that it won't be supported for much longer by Google. So this blog post, again, you can find the link to in the resources section. But it's not a bad thing, because using Android Studio on a 32-bit system wasn't a good experience. And that's because 32-bit versions of Windows have limitations on the amount of RAM that they can use. In fact, only 3.5 gigabytes of RAM can be addressed by 32-bit versions of Windows, and that's really going to make life hard for you as an Android developer. Android Studio really needs more memory to operate effectively. So to check if you're running a 64-bit or 32-bit version of Windows, you can just come down here to the search window. You can either type 32 or type about, and that will bring you to either about your PC, or if you get this option here, see if you have a 32 or 64-bit version. They should both take you to this About page, as you can see here. Now, under Device Specifications, you can see it says System Type. Now, if this says 64-bit operating system, then that means you've got a 64-bit installation and you're good to go. Otherwise, it will say 32-bit, and that would obviously mean you're running a 32-bit installation of Windows. Ignore the processor bit on the right-hand side. It's the Windows installation type that we're after. So if your screen looks like this one and says 64-bit, keep watching the video and follow along. But if yours says 32-bit, then you're probably going to have problems with this course with that version of Windows. There is a version of Android Studio that I alluded to that you can install for a 32-bit version of Windows, but that's again not going to be supported for much longer. The good news is though, that unless you bought your computer a really long time ago, the chances are pretty high that you've already got a 64-bit CPU installed, even if you haven't necessarily got a 64-bit version of Windows. So if you really want to get into Android development, then I suggest that you would install a 64-bit operating system. Now, you probably have to pay to upgrade Windows to 64-bit, but another alternative you can also consider is installing a Linux operating system such as Ubuntu, and you can dual boot that on your Windows machine. And that's a lot cheaper. In fact, it's free, but obviously you need to invest some time in learning a new operating system in that scenario. Right, so moving on now, I'm going to assume that you're running a 64-bit version of Windows. The next thing we want to do is check the CPU. So while we're on this screen, you can take a look at the processor, and note that for me it says Intel, but depending on your computer you may see Intel or another option such as AMD. So if the processor is Intel, as mine is, then you're good to go. However, if the processor is AMD, then there's another step to perform, and things are slightly different because it's an AMD processor. So in that scenario, if you do see AMD, if and only if, then you want to come down to the bottom of the screen down here. We want to type Turn Windows until we get this option here to turn Windows features on or off, or you may need to go into Control Panel and find that. And again, if you're on an AMD processors only, scroll down to the bottom here, and we're looking for Windows Hypervisor Platform, and you can see the checkbox is off for me, but what you'll need to do if you're on an AMD is check that and click OK. Now, obviously, I'm not going to do that because you can see that I'm running a Intel in my scenario. What will happen when you do that and you're running an AMD CPU, it'll adjust Windows, change some settings, and probably require you to reboot. So do that if you're on an AMD CPU, and then come back to this point in the video and continue on as per normal. Alright, so in my case again, I mentioned that I'm on an Intel, so I'm going to cancel that, close down this, and now what we're going to do is go back to the Google search engine, and we're going to install Android Studio. So first things first, we want to find it, and then the easiest thing to do is just do a search for Install Android Studio. And you want to click the first developer.android.com link here. You can see that one says Studio Install, which is correct. Come over here and click on Download the latest version of Android Studio. And this should give you straight away the released latest version of Android Studio. Now, there are options to click over here where you can download other options, a 32-bit version and so forth, that we don't recommend, but we're not going to do any of that. I'm going to go back, and obviously down here it tells us that it's the Windows 64-bit. I'm going to click on that. I'm going to click on I've read and agree. Click on download Android Studio for Windows. We're just going to run that when it's finished. So while it's downloading, keep in mind that the 3.5 you see there may be a higher number when you come to download that. And the reason for that is Google, who own the Android product, they release new versions of Android Studio on a regular basis. So it's very hard because they release so many updates a year to keep these installation videos updated. But the good thing is that generally the installation is very similar to what we'll go through in this video. So if you see a later version there on the same screen that I've got on now, then you can just proceed and download that newer version and you're good to go. Okay, you can see we're just about done here now. We'll let it run its security scan and then it'll probably ask us to update something. And what I'm going to do is just close down the browser because we're finished with that anyway. And you may or may not see this pop up on screen, but it's asking us, do we want to allow this app to make changes to your device? So I'm going to select yes to that, and that will continue the installation. Click on next. We're going to make sure both these options are checked. The first one we can't uncheck anyway. Make sure Android Virtual Device is checked. Click on next. We're going to install to the default location, next, and click on install. We're going to let that go ahead and complete. Okay, that's now completed. We'll click on next, and we'll click on finish, noting that the checkbox for Start Android Studio is checked. And it's obviously going to do just that. You'll get this option if you haven't installed Android Studio on your computer before. It's giving us the option to load the settings or the configuration from another installation. We haven't got one. We're starting from fresh. So I'm just going to click on OK. Next, we've got a wizard that's popped up. I'm going to click on Next here. I'm going to come over and click Custom, Next. You've got a choice of themes here. I'm going to leave it on white as the white background because that comes up better in videos, but you may want to choose Darkula, which is usually, or certainly something that a lot of students would prefer because it's a little bit easier on the eyes. So choose the one you like, click on Next. Here we want to make sure that we've got everything checked. However, there are some notes to keep in mind or things to keep in mind about Intel Haxum. We specifically do not want to install Intel Haxum if you're running an AMD CPU or processor. Now the reason for that is that the Haxum, which is a product that actually speeds up, and I can come over here and check it. It tells you over there that it enables a hardware-assisted virtualization engine. It basically speeds up the Android app emulation. Now that's been written by Intel, and what they've done is specifically make it not work with non-Intel CPUs. So therefore it makes no sense to install it if you're on an AMD CPU, and in fact you'll get errors. So make sure you deselect that if you are not on an Intel CPU for that reason. In my case, I am on an Intel CPU, as we saw earlier in the video. I'm going to check it and click on Next. Now this will only pop up obviously if you selected to check the box for Haxum. This is the amount of RAM in your computer you want to dedicate to Haxum, again to speed up your Android app emulation. It's usually okay to just leave the default. In my case, it's suggesting 2 GB of RAM. As a general piece of advice, if you've got less than 8 GB of RAM total on your computer, do some research and see if your computer can be upgraded to 8 GB, or even better, 16 GB. Memory is relatively cheap and it will make a big difference in the performance of Android Studio and the emulators, etc. But in terms of the RAM you've got on your computer now, if you've got 8 GB or more of RAM in your computer, leave it as the default. That's being selected automatically by the installer. But if you've got less than 8 GB, then you'll need to allocate less to Haxum. Now, depending on just how much memory you've got in your computer, you may need to reduce that to 1 GB or even 512 MB. So I'm going to go ahead and continue the installation of Haxum because probably the majority of Windows computers out there do have Intel CPUs. And obviously we established earlier in the video that mine has. So I'm going to leave the defaults there and click on Next. And then we're going to click on Finish. And we're going to see that there's a download going to take place. So I'm just going to fast forward this and we'll come back when it's reached the next step. Okay, so the installation has continued. Now I've automatically been prompted to allow this app to make changes to your devices, and this is because I've selected Haxum. So you may or may not see this. If it comes up with a pop-up, just click on Yes to Windows Command Processor, and it's actually going now. You can see down the bottom, it's running the Intel Haxum installer. Now, if you tried to do this on an AMD, a machine with an AMD CPU/processor, you will get an error. I'm just going to pop up on the screen what that will look like. You can see in my case it was successfully installed. Now there can be reasons why the Haxam installation will fail even if you are on an Intel CPU, and usually it's got to do with a BIOS change on your computer that you need to change. So if you do find that you get an error similar to the one you can see on screen now, and you have got an Intel CPU, then it might be worth checking that VTX is enabled in your computer's BIOS. And there's a video in this section of the course with the title Enable VTX in BIOS, which you can check out, which should give you the information you need to make that change in your computer. But in my case, you can see that I was successful in installing Haxam, and in fact the Android installation. So I can click on Finish. And at this point, we've done the basic installation of Android Studio. So in the next video, we're going to look at configuring Android Studio. Now do note that I've got a Mac and a Linux Android Studio install video coming up in the next 2 videos, so skip those 2 videos unless you want to also install Android Studio on a Mac or a Linux machine. What you want to do is now go to the video titled Configure Android SDK on all 3 platforms, and there we'll go through the configuration steps we need to get up and running in Android Studio. So I'll see you in the next video.